2, 3. Okay. Hi, everyone. So today's lecture is about communication and storytelling, and I'm going to do the first half, and Hans-Peter is going to do the second half because we both have things we want to say about that. But none of this is material that is traditionally covered in any statistics or CS courses, but we view it as a fundamental part of the data science process, right? You could do the coolest analysis in the world, and if you can't actually explain it in a way that people can understand, that's not going to do you any good. So just a few announcements first. Okay, I'm sure you all know homework 1 due this Thursday, 11:59 p.m. Sections, announcements have been made. You can check Piazza, and we're going to post more information on Piazza about what happens if you can't come to section or if you need to change sections, things like that. There's a video. This Piazza link goes to the description of that video that Luis made that runs through the whole homework submission process. So you should be careful that you follow that and make sure you're familiar with the policies on late days and things like that. In particular, it's based on your last submission to measure whether you're using a late day. So if you submit the homework on time on Thursday, and then on Friday you start making some other updates, pushing more changes into your repository, then you've used a late day because we're looking at the most recent version that you submitted. So don't make any more changes after that submission unless you want to use a late day. And always check your submission. So last time we taught this course, that there were a few situations where the student uploaded the wrong file, and you create your IPython notebook, and then the student uploaded the wrong file. And at the time, we were using iSites, which makes it kind of a pain to actually check your submission. But here in GitHub, it renders right there. So it shouldn't be too hard to check. So make sure you check things like that. OK. So let's start. How do you communicate? So this talk pertains to written communication, writing a talk. It pertains to giving a talk at a conference, just about how would you communicate what you're doing in general. Well, there's two fundamental questions that you should always be asking. And you should make sure that your audience always knows the answers to these two questions. Because if the audience doesn't know the answer, the talk is going to be bad. Okay? First fundamental question, what's the goal? It's a very obvious, natural question, but I can't even count how many times I've been to a conference and the speaker thought it was obvious to everyone what he or she was doing, but the audience actually had no clue what is the purpose of all this, right? Because the speaker was so eager to show off all this technical stuff and not really explaining the motivation, not really keeping the eye on the ball, right, in terms of what are you actually trying to do. In particular, there are many different types of goals, and most of these, will come up in one way or another in this course, in homeworks and lectures. We're going to be talking a lot about prediction, right? So you might want to build a predictive model, predict election results, things like that. Or you might want to be actually trying to gain more scientific understanding, and you might care a lot about interpretation, and that you want to feel like you're really understanding the underlying process. Because you might have something that just does a great job at predicting, but you have no idea what it's actually doing, and is it actually, explaining something scientifically, right? Sometimes you want to test hypotheses. Sometimes you want to make comparisons between different groups. Sometimes you need to make a decision, and you want to, you have certain loss functions or cost functions, and you have uncertainty everywhere. And the field of decision analysis is all about how do you make rational decisions under uncertainty. Sometimes, remember that quote, we're drowning in data but starved for information? Sometimes we just feel like, we have so much data and we don't know what to do with it. The human mind can't, really visualize or process these high-dimensional, complicated, massive data sets very easily. So sometimes we want to, reduce the complexity and, build a simple model or build, a simplification to reduce the dimension into something that a human being can comprehend. Remember, all models are wrong, but some models are useful. And so, we want to simplify to get something that we can think about as human beings because, we have limited mental capacities, limited memories, and everything. And, sometimes we want to build a recommendation system. So there are all kinds of different goals we might have. And sometimes we might be pursuing a couple of these goals at the same time. But usually there's one primary goal, and you have to make it really clear throughout what you're doing. Okay, second fundamental question. Even simpler. Who cares? I think this was actually the most important thing I learned from my advisor in grad school, who was Percy Diaconis, who was a famous mathematician. But probably the most important thing I learned from him was to always ask, who cares? Because if if no one actually cares about it, then why are you doing it, right? Very simple question, but you'd be surprised how often that just thinking about that question helps you to focus, what should you communicate? And this also relates to the question of who's your audience, which Hans-Peter is going to talk about later, that you have to keep your audience in mind, but if you don't know who cares about what you're doing, you don't really know what audience to pitch it to. So you'll always keep those two questions in mind. And I came up with an acronym. This is not the only way to outline something, but this is one way that I kind of like for organizing statistics or data science paper or a presentation, and that's iMac. I stands for inferential goal. So we want to start with some questions. You have some scientific question of interest, and you're hoping to shed light on it, right? And we emphasize this with the data science process, too. It's all iterative, but it starts with asking an interesting question, okay? It doesn't start with big data. It starts with a question. So we want to say, it should be clear what question are you trying to address. Usually we need some kind of model, which is an oversimplification, but hopefully gives some insights. We normally need, quite a bit of algorithms in order to deal with complicated data sets. And then at the end of the day, not only to have some interpretable conclusions, but to check whether your answers make sense. So, I've been to so many talks where I felt like it was a bait and switch, in the sense that they started out with some problem that sounded incredibly cool, and they used this to kind of construct some kind of, they turned that problem, motivating problem, into some statistical mathematical language and did a lot of math, and then never circled back and said, what did we learn about the original motivating problem? Okay, and that's very frustrating. Or sometimes they give some, results about the original motivating problem, but do nothing to actually check, do those results actually make sense, right? So if we made some prediction, can we test those predictions? Or we try another approach to the problem, and do we get a similar answer? Something to check the stability or robustness or accuracy. Okay, so these are pretty basic things, but so many talks and papers kind of fail at least some of these things. So here's a few principles for presentations. Okay, remember the golden rule. So do unto others as you would have done unto yourself. My rule of thumb, I don't know if Hans-Peter agrees based on the conferences he's been to, but my rule of thumb from conferences I've been to in the last 10 years is that almost every single conference I've been to, 80% of the talks are terrible, which is really sad. It's about an 80% thing. The exceptions have been conferences that I co-organized. Like Hans-Peter and I organized a really good one on data science a while ago. We'll link to the videos at some point because the videos are online. We picked the speakers to be people who could actually communicate. So that's pretty sad. So I call it, golden rule type of thing, because it's even sadder if you think about the fact that, I'm at a conference, I'm sitting with the rest of the audience, and everyone in the audience is seeing how horrible the talk is, and then, the person next to me gets up and does the exact same thing, right? So it's not like, there's something very weird about it. Know your audience. We'll come back to that later. Tell a story. Hans-Peter is going to be saying a lot about that, so I'll leave that to him. Choose and use notation carefully. I think speakers forget all the time that they've been, doing this work for weeks, months, or even years, and they're intimately familiar with their notations, okay? But you, the audience, are probably seeing it for the first time. You can't right? It's hard enough to remember a 7-digit phone number, right? And then suddenly you're expected to know all this new notation, instantly absorb the entire set of notations that speaker is using. That's not realistic. Read great writers. So, the great thing about reading stuff that's well written is you'll learn a lot about the content, and you'll learn a lot about how to present it well. and create a clear sense of direction. So sometimes you read something where it's just meandering all over the place. It's not clear, you know, what the flow is. You want to make sure that what you write has a clear arrow of logic, like it's going in a certain direction, and the reader is going to have certain expectations for which way you're heading, and you're actually, you know, trying to satisfy those expectations unless you have a good reason for surprising the reader by going in a different direction. And normally, you know, you have a clear sense of direction. You use signposting, which basically means, you know, remind the reader, like, here's what we've done, here's where we are, here's where we're going, right? So that it feels like you're following a natural path. So a little bit more about notation. Littlewood was a famous British mathematician, and he said, it was said of Jordan's writings that if he had 4 things on the same footing, which you would normally call A, B, C, D, they would appear as A, M prime sub 3, epsilon 2, and pi double prime 1, 2. And there are some, this is an exaggeration, but there are some people who will write this way. And so, you know, if you have things that kind of should be parallel, you should give them parallel names, right? And you shouldn't constantly be changing your own notation. And you should have some conventions, right? You know, capital letters mean something, lowercase letters mean something, script letters mean something. Try to follow some consistent conventions. This was another example from Helmholtz, who was a famous mathematical expositor. And he said his nightmare was to have a sequence n epsilon that goes to 0 as epsilon goes to infinity. Because usually in math, we like to use epsilon as a very small positive number, and usually n is an integer, and then this is just, you know, completely bizarre notation. This, I'm not going to talk about now. I just wanted to have in the slides some links. These are 4 references to PDFs that I think are really good about scientific writing and scientific communication, so you can look at them later. One of those papers is called The Science of Scientific Writing, which I thought has some really good examples and insights about how to do clear scientific communication. A lot of stuff you might read is really superficial, like you know, use active voice rather than passive voice, which is often good, but that's actually kind of misses the point. The point is like having a clear flow. It's not about active versus passive or, you know, grammatical things like that. It's about the flow. So this was an example they gave. I'm not going to try to read this out loud. You can see how horrible this is. You know, you can't even read one sentence of this. And at first sight, it might look like this is horrible because of all the jargon, right? So, you know, if you're not familiar with you know, adeno, sino, phosphate, whatever, it's going to be very hard to read this. Okay, so yes, it is too packed with jargon, and you should be careful to use jargon sparingly. But the authors of this article that I took this example from made the point that it's not just the jargon here. And so they simplified this just by replacing these long these long technical terms with just like A, B, C, D, E. Okay, this is the smallest of the URFs, and A has been identified as a B. Subunit 8 gene, the functional significance of the other URFs has been, on the contrary, elusive. Recently, however, these experiments, as well as these studies, have indicated blah, blah, blah. It's still hard to follow the thread, right? We got rid of the jargon. It's still, because it's not well organized. It's not, you know, each sentence doesn't kind of give the reader the right expectation for what's going to come next. And in particular, it's really unclear how these sentences are related. You know, how does it flow? And it's also unclear what the emphasis is. You know, is the emphasis on the smallest of the URFs, or is the emphasis on the fact that, you know, these other ones' significance has been elusive? It's not really clear what is the main point that they're trying to make here. So it's not just the jargon. And another problem with this, I just pulled out one sentence. This is really only one sentence from it. The problem is not so much the fact that the sentence is long, although long sentences definitely are often harder to read than short sentences. But notice here that it's not just that the sentence is so long, is look at how far apart the subject and the verb are. So the subject of this sentence is experiments. And so you're trying to read, okay, so you see, okay, this is a sentence about these experiments. And then you want to know what's going on with these experiments? You need a verb, right? You need the subject and the verb to go together. And you read this, you go, with antibodies to purify blah, 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 blah. It's really hard to find the verb. But finally, it's indicated, which is not a very exciting verb anyway. So they're so far apart that it's just almost unreadable. So things like that. And that paper that I mentioned is full of examples like this. So I'll let you read that. Just wanted to do one example like that. Okay. So this is another famous example called Linda the Bank Teller. That was developed by Kahneman and Tversky. So the example, in case you haven't seen it, the example goes like this. This problem was given to a bunch of students. Actually, this survey, it's been replicated many times, or different people are given this question. Linda is 31 years old, single, outspoken, and very bright. She majored in philosophy. As a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice, and also participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. Okay, and then the question is, which is more probable? 1, Linda is a bank teller. 2, Linda is a bank teller and is active in the feminist movement. Right. So this was asked to, the original study by Kahneman and Tversky, they did a survey of Stanford business school students. And 85% of them said that option 2 is more probable. But that's impossible, right? You don't need to have taken Stat 110 to know that if you take a probability of something that has more conditions, it's less likely. And mathematically, it has to be the case that 1 is more likely. As soon as you pile on more things, it becomes less and less likely. And yet, 85%. Okay, so is there something wrong with Stanford students? Oh no, this study was replicated many times, many places, and it's a very consistent thing. And it's still being debated today. What's the best explanation? Like, how much of it has to do with the way it's worded? How much of it has to do with fundamental biases and misunderstandings and probability that are kind of innate to human beings? So they explained this with the intuition that people like to think in terms of kind of a representative example. So they read the stuff about Linda, and they form a mental picture. Like, they imagine someone, and then they just pick the option. The most probable option is the option that best fits the profile. Okay, but that's not actually how probability works. All right, the main reason I'm mentioning this example now is that I heard Kahneman actually won a Nobel Prize for this work, okay? And I heard him give a talk here about the kind of the history of this work. And the Linda the bank teller example is just a beautiful example because it's so simple and memorable, right? If you haven't seen it before and now you know it, you're always going to remember this, Linda the bank teller, okay? And what Kahneman said was that they emphasized this example in their original paper because that was basically as far as they had gotten, right? They couldn't really explain what was going on. And they spent their entire careers pretty much trying to understand examples like this. They developed a lot of theory, a lot of psychology, a lot of economics kind of built around this. And they were trying to, because at the time, they thought, oh, we should do something really theoretical, right? So what Kahneman said was if he had already developed the theory, he would have emphasized that. He might not have even included this example, and that would have been a terrible blunder because no one remembers the general theory. People remember Linda the bank teller. Okay, so the message there is that you want to have a simple but memorable example, right? And it might be a toy example, or it might be you take some little subset of your data and just something that's easy to understand that makes your main point. And yeah, it's great to have theory, and it's great to do full analysis on everything. But you need to have memorable stories and examples like this. Okay. Okay, so often when you write something, you need to write an abstract or some kind of summary first. This is the most abstract I've ever seen. This is from a real paper. He said, this paper describes several problems, all arising from one real-world problem. Some of these problems have been solved, and others offer interesting challenges. I almost think that there must have been like some inside joke here. The authors of this are good statisticians, and maybe they were just having fun with it. But the sad thing is that this was published in this form, though, you know, in a real journal, a reputable statistics journal. But the sad thing is that there are a lot of abstracts that are really not that different from this, right? You know, not quite as abstract, but just basically we had a challenge, and you know, we did something, and you know, it's not. And this one is from PhD Comics. And by the way, any grad student, if you don't read PhD Comics, you're missing out. If you're considering grad school, you should go to PhD Comics, because it gives all kinds of insights into academia and as well as research and teaching. Anyway, this is from PhD Comics, Abstract Mad Libs. So if you have never played Mad Libs before, it's the game where, you know, it has some kind of skeleton text and fill in the blank, and it'll tell you, like, you write a noun here and a verb here, and you fill in the blanks like that, and then you read the thing, and often it comes out really funny. So this was like, you know, abstract, you know, for writing an abstract. And, you know, the paper presents, so this is almost like a template that you could use for an abstract, and, you know, fill in a bunch of buzzwords and, you know, say how much your methods are better and everything like that. And, you know, this is a really boring, generic way to write. You know, you should try to catch the reader's interest and not seem like you're being completely generic. All right, so I already said tell a story. Hans-Peter is going to say a lot more about that, but I just want to you know, introduce that. A story has a beginning, a middle, and an end, okay? And, you know, your talk or your paper should have a complete story in it. It's not satisfying if it ends in the middle. It's not satisfying if you jump to the middle and you don't know, you know, you didn't motivate anything. In particular, how do you actually write a story? Well, you need some characters, right? So, you know, they could be people, they could be trees or genes or whatever you're studying, but there's something, they have to be interesting in some way. If they're not interesting, why are you even studying it? Okay, so you set things up by introducing the characters, and then there needs to be a predicament, right? So they face some kind of predicament that, you know, that they need to solve, and then you try to resolve the predicament, and then leave room for sequels. That's a good strategy if you're an author and doing this as a career. But that's actually, I think, a good metaphor for the scientific process as well. The best work in data science is usually going to raise more questions than it answers. That's not a bad thing, right? You know, you want to answer some questions, but that's going to, you know, raise other things. There's always going to be limitations, and hopefully there's always going to be interesting future directions you could go, because these are complicated problems. Real-world data are messy. There's many different questions you could ask. So you do not want to just present it, in most cases, like you have ended everything and then that's just, you know, case closed and you've resolved everything that there is to know. Because first of all, that's less interesting. It's more interesting if sometimes that, you know, that it inspires future work. That's a great thing. But it's also more honest, right? Because if you present it like, you know, you've completely solved everything, that's just not realistic, right? Because you always, in order to do anything, you have to start somewhere, right? You need to make some assumptions, okay? And you want to be explicit about your assumptions. And then, you know, the model is not perfect. The method you use is not perfect. Everything could be refined. So you want to be really upfront about the limitations and where could you go from there in the future, as well as hopefully having some nice concrete results. So you've made some progress, but you've opened some doors, and you know, being very honest about what you have shown and what you haven't shown, things like that. Just being as clear and honest as possible is important. Okay, well, I'm going to hand it over give you this, and
right.
you turn that one on?
I think I'm all good, yes.
Okay,
Thank
great.
you. Thank you, Joe. So Joe mentioned that 80% of the talks he's seen at conferences were terrible. And I want to corroborate that. I went to a statistics conference, and 80% of the talks I saw were terrible. But in my own field, in visualization and computer graphics, it's actually less severe because we use a lot of visuals. And that's one of the messages I want to start with. If you give a talk, use a lot of visuals. First of all, they break up the flow. Secondly, they're interesting to look at, and you can tell a story with them. And so what I want to do now is show you a bunch of examples of good storytelling with visuals and hopefully inspire you to do something similar in your final project, in particular when you're doing your final 2-minute summary video that we ask you to do for your project. So stories are important. You know, beginning of humankind, we started to tell stories with cave drawings and you know, petroglyphs and whatnot. And stories have been told around campfires for ages. And stories are really powerful because they're enduring and they're emotionally touching and they are memorable. So whenever you can tell a story with your data, you should do that. And I would argue it's always possible. It takes a lot of effort sometimes, but the effort is totally worth it. So try to phrase whatever you're doing in the form of a story. And I think Joe's outline that he just gave you is a very good one. So I'm going to show you a couple examples, and then we'll talk a little bit more about what goes into the story. So I want to start with this example here, which is a video by the New York Times telling you something about Manuel Rivera, one of the greatest baseball players of all times. So I'm just going to play this, and then we're going to discuss this a little bit.
Mariano Rivera is one of the most dominant closers in history. But what may be most remarkable is that he has done it by confounding hitters with mostly one pitch, his signature cutter. John Flaherty of the Yes Network faced Rivera as a hitter and also caught him when he played for the Yankees.
From a hitter's standpoint, he's out on the mound. It feels like he's not even putting any effort into it, and the ball explodes on you. And from a catching standpoint, he's the easiest guy ever to catch because he throws the ball right where you want it.
Rivera uses a seemingly effortless delivery, which he can flawlessly repeat pitch after pitch. His cutter is thrown very much like a fastball, but the pitch has significant lateral movement. He creates and adjusts this movement with the different pressure he puts on the ball with his fingers. The pitch's lateral movement keeps it off the bat's sweet spot, moving in on the hands of a left-handed batter and toward the end of the bat of a righty. To a hitter, Rivera's cutter first appears like a straight fastball, making it hard to distinguish the two pitches during the first fractions of a second when the hitter must decide if, when, and where to swing. Hitters often rely on reading a pitch's spin to determine what pitch is coming, but Rivera's fastball and cutter have what appear to the hitter as the same spin. Many pitchers throw their cutters more like sliders, with their fingers pulling down on the side of the ball. This can create more downward and lateral movement than a cutter, but it also creates the signature spin of a slider, a spinning red dot that the hitter can recognize and adjust to. With identical deliveries and spins on Rivera's pitches, hitters are at a loss to identify and then attack the pitch until it is too late, and the balls end up in very different locations. Here are the nearly 1,300 pitches that Rivera threw in 2009, each frozen at the point when the batter must make his swing decisions. But with few clues to determine the pitch's ultimate location, the batter can be faced with guessing at these outcomes. Here are the cutters to left-handers. Here are the cutters to right-handers. And fastballs to right-handers. He throws almost no fastballs to lefties. As this map of his 2009 pitches shows, Rivera is remarkably adept at hitting the corners, keeping the ball away from the middle of the plate, the easiest spot for a batter to make good contact.
Looking from this perspective, it's not surprising that the real hot spot is inside on a lefty. I think he could hit that spot with his eyes closed.
Rivera's simple but effective formula has made him baseball's most dominant closer.
How many of you are baseball fans? All right. How many of you play baseball? Okay, so I played baseball when I just came to the United States, and I started to study for my PhD, and I joined the baseball team. And I have to admit, it was the first time where I played a sport and I was bored. standing, in the outfield waiting for something to happen. So I didn't get it, right? I really didn't get baseball for a long time. And then finally, I went to a couple of actual professional games, and I got the excitement, and I got the atmosphere. And then I went to the Red Sox games, and that was it. I'm sold. I get it. It's exciting. It's fun. This video is remarkable to me personally because it told me things I didn't know before. And I don't know how many of you knew about the difference between a fastball and a slider or a curveball. I didn't really get that baseball was that technical because nobody had explained it to me. So I think this video is striking a remarkable balance between fun to look at and yet informative. And so I'm hoping that in your final videos you can strike a similar balance, conveying an important message and telling the audience something they didn't know before, while at the same time telling a story that's engaging and that's interesting to listen to. So when you watch something like this, or when you think about your own stories, I think there's a few key questions you should ask. And Joe already mentioned the first one, which is who is the audience? And that's, a very important question. So who do you think in this video is the audience? Yeah. Baseball fans? Yes? That's right. I actually think the audience is the general audience. It's not just baseball fans. Of course, it's also for baseball fans, but this was accessible enough to me, right, who knew nothing about any of this. And so I do think the New York Times deliberately made this accessible to their general readers. So, and ideally, when you do your stories for your final project, make it accessible to anybody, right, and everybody. So that's really difficult. It takes time. But I think it's also important. By the way, why is it important? It's an obvious point. I just want to make it explicit. Why is it important that you should make your talk accessible to everybody? Shouldn't it be just for the specialists, the data scientists? I mean, if you make it accessible to everybody, you're losing all the details. Yeah.
Well, I feel like you're having this talk, you want to get people from other fields interested in the topic.
That's right.
A lot of discovery and a lot of really cool research.
That's right. And so, exactly. So what you said is, make it exciting for other people and get them interested in learning more about your research. So, and this is a difference between the different media of communication. If you write a paper, you can't write a technical paper that's generally accessible because you usually have to use jargon, you have to use, you're going to talk about machine learning, you're going to talk about modeling and statistics and so on. And so that's not really accessible to everybody. But that's actually the supplemental material to your talk or to your 2-minute video that you're going to do. And in the video, the goal is not to relay all of those details. The video is an advertisement for your report. Okay, think about it that way. And a presentation should be an advertisement for your paper. So they serve two different goals, and I would argue two different audiences. So when you give a talk, even in a technical setting, you want to make it accessible for everybody in the audience, not just the narrow specialists who happen to know exactly what your little specialty is. And similarly, in your final projects, make the video and the presentation accessible to everybody. And then your report and your IPython notebooks, of course, will have all of the gory details that will be accessible to people in the field of data science. Then, what are the questions that this video answered? Do you remember any questions that it answered? Yes?
Mariano Rivera's sweet spots?
Where are his sweet spots? Exactly. And what was the memorable visualization that you...
Like heat map on both edges of
The heat map on both ends, and when he threw these, I forget how many, 300 or something, or was it 1,000 balls at the same time? That was pretty memorable for me. Does anybody remember any other questions that this might have answered? Yeah?
Where the particular ball for like each type of player would land, so like where the ball would be for like a right-handed batter as opposed to a left-handed batter.
Right. Where does he pitch for a lefty versus a righty, and exactly, for the different types of players. Yeah?
More generally, what makes a dominant closer in baseball?
That's right. What makes a dominant closer? And this is a perfect example of somebody who is a dominant closer. And so it's not just about always hitting fastballs. It's about the variety and actually making it very, very difficult to hit these balls. And for me, as I said before, the difference between the different types of balls, I didn't really appreciate that until I saw that. And also the red spinning dot that you get for some of those. Those are really interesting questions. So why should the audience care in this particular case? Why should we care about this? Did they answer that question? Yeah.
If you want to have if you're a Yankees fan or a baseball fan and you want to have a good team, what types of things should you be looking for in a closer?
That's right. What kinds of things should you be looking for if you're, putting together a team? I actually think there's a historical context. They said multiple times he's the most dominant closer in baseball right now, and very likely is going to be a Hall of Famer. And so I think the historical context is important. So understanding how people are successful in baseball is actually important, and that's why I think people care to know about these things. And of course, this was in the New York Times, so it does help to have a captive audience that's excited about baseball. What are your major insights? I think we already talked about this, so that's related to the questions. So, whenever you have a question, you also want to present the insight. But I think, importantly, this word surprises is important too, right? We want to have some surprises as well. So there were certain messages in this video that surprised me, that I didn't know about before, and that kept my attention. And finally, was there any change that this video wanted to affect? Not necessarily, right? In this case, I think this was more informational. But we'll see a couple examples where they really try to affect change, and to affect change, you actually have to engage the audience much more on an emotional basis. So it's usually a topic that's much more emotional and maybe closer to people's hearts, and literally gets them emotionally involved, and that can then affect change in their behavior. So, know your audience. We've said it now many times. This audience here, doesn't look very captivated. They're all over the place. Their attention is all over the place. If I look into this audience here, I see some of your attentions are captivated by your laptops, but I'm assuming you're typing notes as I speak. But I think the point, importantly, is that you need to know your audience. So that doesn't mean you need to know them on a first-name basis, but it does mean you have to think about your audience before you give a presentation or before you make your final 2-minute video. So the first question you might want to ask is, what do they know? So let's just put yourselves in your shoes. You just finished your final project, and now you're working on your 2-minute video, and I just told you your audience is the internet, right, everybody. So what is the answer to this question? What does the internet know about your particular project? And that depends, right? It depends on the project. So if it's a project about global warming, well, you can assume that people have already heard about this, and they may have very preconceived opinions about it and preconceived notions. That's a fair assumption. If it's about something more specialized, then you have to think about, what do people actually know? So that's an important question. Then what does people motivate, right? If I'm giving a talk to an audience, I have to ask myself, well, why are they here? Why did they come to listen to me? You guys presumably came because you want to learn about this class, you want to learn about data science, but you also want to be successful in your homeworks and final projects. So you're thinking that this might help you, and the answer is it will. But really, what's the motivation for people to pay attention to you? And what is their desire? Why are they deeply engaged in whatever topic you're presenting? Your desire, hopefully, is to learn knowledge, right? And then, what experience do you share with the audience? I mean, I shared the experiences with you of being a student. I was sitting in many, many lecture halls for many, many years, and so I know what it feels like from the other side. And so, You know, what are the common goals? Well, I think we all have the common goal of basically teaching and learning, right? I want to teach, you hopefully want to learn, so we share those common goals. And finally, what insights can I give you? And, you know, this nice phrase by Nancy Duarte, what magical gifts can we give you in this course? And hopefully we'll give you the magical gifts of the data science process. So the whole process is really what we emphasize in this class, including communication, right? And so hopefully you get the magical gifts to make you an accomplished data scientist. So this statement here may be a little bit controversial, but you know, don't make your audience think. What that really means is don't be too jargony, and Joe already mentioned this. Now, of course, you want them to be engaged and you want them to think. So this is a little bit flip. But what it really means is people, in particular when they attend a presentation, don't want to necessarily spend the cognitive effort to understand all of the notation. Right? So that's what Joe was talking about. So don't have them really understand all of the notation if you can avoid it. If you do your 2-minute video, don't make them too complicated. Keep it at a level that is easy to follow. And you have to lead through the major steps of what you discovered. Here is the problem, this is why you should care, here is our approach, and here are our findings. And finally, you know, here is what we want you to do next. Go change the world with what we found. So you want to point out these interesting facts and these insights, and you can even do that in text or in your notebooks through captions and annotations. So many times, you know, I see visualizations like this. This is just an example. It doesn't really mean what the data is. It's not important what the data is, but you see a visualization like this, and you kind of have to really spend a lot of effort to try to understand what are they trying to say. So this is called burying the lead. You know, the lead is sort of the top story here. And instead, try to do this. Give them the message in the title so that whenever they look at the graphics or whenever they look at the following captions and text, they already know what the message is. And the message is very clear. User satisfaction varies greatly by feature. And that's the message. So make that very explicit. And that's what I mean when I say don't make them think. Make the main message explicit as possible. And then, of course, support it with supporting data and visualizations and with supporting arguments. I want to show you a quick example from my visualization class, which I just like, and I think it's a good example of leading a story through a visualization of the New York Times.
Hi, I'm Dave Giacopelli. I love the New York Times, but I couldn't tell you quantitatively why, so I decided to get some data and visualize it. My data set includes 24 years of New York Times articles from 87 to 2010, 2.2 million articles total. Those articles are positioned here on the timeline. By rolling over the timeline, you can see a one-day bin of all the articles from that day, typically around 200 to 300. The world map highlights all of the countries mentioned that day and helps give an impression of the global emphasis of the Times. Panning across the timeline shows Africa being the most lightly covered. By hovering over the countries, on the map you have a different view of the data. Here you're seeing all of the days that a country was mentioned in the Times. China is clearly on the Times radar. Namibia was covered about every 10 days. Going back to the timeline, you can see there's something plotted that's kind of spiky here. This is currently an article count, and these spikes are the Sunday edition. Apparently, it isn't just advertisements, you get twice the articles on Sunday. If we zoom out, take a look at all 24 years, you can see larger trends. Article count, for instance, is dropping a little bit in the past couple years, but to compensate for that, if we switch to words per article, you can see there's a bit of an upward trend in the words per article. Articles are getting a little longer. Another interesting discovery was positive words. I made a positive word list, and all of a sudden in 97, there was a huge uptick in positive words. Maybe somebody sent out a memo and ask everyone to be more upbeat in their reporting. Finally, whatever view you're in, there's a sidebar over here that provides a lot more details.
So this is a great example of a 2-minute video for a final project. This was for a different class, but you get the gist. He tells a story, he makes it interesting, he makes it kind of fun to look at the different visualization, and he explains the features of what he's actually done. But he also points out interesting insights. And I think that's something you should be thinking about too. So whatever insights you came up with, point those out in your video. Those insights might actually be much more important than what particular model you used or what particular machine learning method or how many nodes you used on your Hadoop cluster. So try to think of your insights and try to convey them and point them out in this video. The other important thing is make it very explicit what the question is that you're answering. So here is some data, Bigfoot sightings. So for people who don't know what Bigfoot is, I want to make that very clear. So here's a bunch of depictions of Bigfoot. Bigfoot is kind of a mix between an ape and a humanoid, and he's supposed to be giant, and there's many sightings of Bigfoots. So there's lots of quote-unquote photographic evidence of Bigfoot sightings. Now, of course, scientists have a hard time with this because, frankly, scientifically, this doesn't really make sense and it has never been proven. However, there is a Bigfoot field researchers organization, which I didn't know about, so I looked it up, and sure enough, the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization, founded in 1995, the only scientific research organization exploring the Bigfoot mystery. That might tell you something. Now, what these guys do, you can report a sighting, so that's good if you ever see Bigfoot, so remember this website. So one important lesson in this class is how to report a Bigfoot sighting. But they also have the data set where all these Bigfoot sightings happened. Right? And that gets me back to this visualization here. So, you have this map, presumably with Bigfoot sightings, and then you have some kind of a temporal graph of number of Bigfoot sightings, and then you have a table. If you have something like this, what do you think the title of this page should be? Yeah?
Bigfoot sightings correlates with population density.
Bigfoot sightings correlates with population density. Yeah, that's actually a pretty good title. Other ideas? Back. Yes, all the way back.
People seem to have gotten better at finding Bigfoot.
People seem to have gotten better at finding Bigfoot. Yeah, sightings over time. Okay, but there's another thing you might notice. What is happening to the sightings over time recently? Say that loud, please. Bigfoot is going extinct, right? The sightings are actually decreasing if you look at the most recent data. So, okay, so the first title idea might be, where is Bigfoot being sighted? I think I like the one with the correlation with population density better. But I think a better title is Bigfoot sightings are in decline. And make that timeline the headline, right? And so I think that's actually an interesting thing. And I found a nice XKCD comic that explains why this is happening. So this is the plot of percentage of the US population carrying cameras everywhere they go, every waking moment of their lives. And you can see it's going up exponentially. And then the caption says, in the last few years with very little fanfare, we've conclusively settled the questions of flying saucers, lake monsters, ghosts, and Bigfoot. So I think the reason Bigfoot sightings are going down is because we have so many cameras that there's just the corroborating evidence isn't there anymore because there's probably 5 other people around you that have a camera. So even if you think you captured Bigfoot, they probably didn't, right? So anyway, so much for that. But the important lesson here is if you do make your question explicit, you should put it in the title, and it should be something interesting and exciting. You want to make something unexpected in your talk or in your presentation or in your 2-minute video, right? So just some nugget that you found that you didn't know before. So David Jacopilli pointed out a few unexpected features that he didn't expect, like this uptick in positive words all of a sudden. And, that might lead to more questions. These unexpected things surprise the audience, and they might grab their attention, and they might actually draw them back. So here is the classic, the 5-second rule when you drop some food on the floor, and every parent, including me, says, well, it's a 5-second rule, you can still eat it. It turns out scientifically that has been proven wrong. So that's unexpected, right? It's a little bit of a surprise. So when I say that in a talk, people might actually all of a sudden think, oh, really? Why? And so that gets their attention. So having some unexpectedness in your presentation and in your final videos is a good thing, but don't make it a gimmick. It has to be actually factual. So I want to show you another video from the New York Times where they talk about Usain Bolt and more generally about sprinting.
Just how fast was Usain Bolt's gold medal sprint? Let's put him on a slightly bigger stage and see him race against every Olympic medalist since 1896. This imaginary race, assembled using runners' average speeds, reveals just how much faster sprinters have become. A few lanes over, we see another Usain Bolt, who dominated the field in Beijing in 2008. Almost 10 feet back, Carl Lewis, gold medalist in Seoul in 1988. He won in 1984 too, one of just a handful of sprinters on this track twice. As we go further back in time, we pass more of the fastest sprinters in history. Jim Hines, the first man to break 10 seconds in the Olympics. Jesse Owens, who won 4 golds in Berlin in 1936. Archie Hahn, Milwaukee Meteor, who won 3 events in 1904. And finally, near the end of this track, we have Tom Burke, who won in Athens in 1896. His time, 12 seconds, puts him more than 60 feet behind today's winner. So what can we take away from this picture? For one, a lot of these sprinters are from the US. Although Americans have had a rivalry with British sprinters, and, more recently, Caribbean athletes, nearly half of these runners are Americans. But we can also see the glory is fleeting. Repeat performances are rare. There's been a new winner on the podium in all but 3 Olympics. But to get a little bit more perspective, let's see how some of America's best young sprinters would fit into this group. Here are the fastest kids at the 100-meter dash at different ages, as recorded by the Amateur Athletic Association. Obviously, they're way behind today's athletes. But they're not as far behind as you might expect. America's fastest 8-year-old did the 100-meter dash in 13 and a half seconds, which would have put him less than a second off 3rd place in 1896. Not bad for grade school. And the record for 15 to 16-year-olds is a 10.27. Good enough for a bronze as recently as 1980. Still, it's not like those Olympians were slow. Despite more than a century of improvements in nutrition, fitness, footwear, and track surfaces, the difference between today's athletes and the fastest humans of the 19th century? Just about 3 seconds.
So this video has a lot of surprises, right? It kind of surprises you with interesting insights, almost every other different display. I mean, I personally like the one with the kids the most because that was really interesting, especially when they tilted it towards the side to compare it against historical times. But I think it's pretty clear that this is an interesting story. And then, when you've done this, now you can dig into the data, right? Now you can actually get the details, and now you can really look at your favorite hero of the 100-meter dash and sort of figure out where do they fit in with this picture. So whenever you tell your stories, try to make them interesting, surprising, and point out insights that you found out that might actually surprise the audience. So whenever you give a talk or whenever you do a 2-minute video or any kind of communication, typically you have a message in mind. Typically you have a point of view. Nobody can be completely neutral. It's very, very difficult to be completely neutral. And so that message can either enhance your message or can enhance your communication, or it can be detrimental, right? So the sort of framing of your story is important, and that gets back to the question of why should the audience care? So framing the story means you're framing it in a particular context. You're putting a scaffold around the story that is very particular to your point of view, and it's very particular to the message you'd like to have to the audience. And it can be emotional framing, it can be framing based on facts. Whatever it is, you're going to carve out the niche of your story out of the context of the world. And that framing is very important. So if you're doing your job well, whatever insights you're presenting will be obvious within the framing that you put around it. Right? So it shouldn't be a surprise within that framing. It should fit within the frame, within the context of your story. Now, give you 2 examples. Here is a traditional analytics dashboard for finance. And, without getting into the detail, I'm sure you've seen many of these in newspapers and in, magazines and maybe online. What is the particular framing here? Well, I'd say it's a professional audience, and it's people interested in finance, and it's kind of neutral, right? You're trying to present finance information. Now, this is in contrast to this graph, right? This is Iraq's bloody toll. So this is basically number of people that died in Iraq over a period of time of I can't read the first year, 2003 until 2013. Now, what's special about this graph? It's upside down. It looks like blood dripping, right? So obviously they didn't have to choose this, and obviously they did it on purpose with a particular frame of reference, right? And the title, I think, frames this particular question. It's a bloody toll, right? So clearly they have a point of view. Now, is that point of view shared by everybody? Probably not. So they took a risk by being very opinionated about what they think about the deaths in Iraq. And so I think that's what framing is, and that's what messaging is. You can take a point of view, and you can go out on a limb and make that point of view very clearly visible, and you might actually have a better chance of affecting people's emotions, right? This is a much more emotionally engaging graph than the one I showed you before. Now, if you do this, what do you have to keep in mind? Most of all. Yeah? Yes.
One of the last things you mentioned, crossing is distorting it and portraying it.
That's correct. Don't lose your, what was the word I used? Integrity. Right? Don't distort the data. Don't lose your integrity. Don't lie. Now, did these guys lie? Probably not, right? It's a bar graph. It's a fair representation. It starts at the 0 line, 2 thumbs up. And it just happens to use a different visual image of what we normally associate with a bar graph, right? It looks more like blood. But I don't think they're distorting the data. But that's a really good point. Make sure you keep your integrity. What other consideration is very important when you do this? We already talked about it. Well, would you do this in your PhD defense? No, why not? Say again? It's not for the right audience, exactly. You have to keep your audience in mind, right? It's very, very important. Now, the difference between exploratory and neutral and explanatory and opinionated is a bit extreme here, but I think in either case, between those 2 extremes, you need to really keep your audience in mind and make sure that whatever you do is appropriate. So if you're giving a presentation at a board meeting, which I'm sure many of you will probably do in your careers, you're going to have to keep that in mind. You don't want to show the graph on the right. Right? You probably want to stick more towards neutral. Whereas if you give a presentation in a lecture, which hopefully many of you will also experience, either for a research audience or maybe in teaching, that's a totally different audience. There you can actually venture more towards the right and more towards being opinionated, but still you want to keep it professional and you want to keep it, probably more neutral. If you give a presentation in a small meeting, your own team, that you're leading, you can basically set the tone that is appropriate based on, the culture of that team. And every team has a different culture. My group were very informal, and so I wouldn't mind showing them something opinionated because we have that kind of culture in that group. And then finally, if you give a TED Talk, my impression is the point is to actually be as opinionated as possible, right? So you want to actually cause a little bit of a stir, and you want to actually get some emotional reaction from the audience. So there it's perfectly okay and maybe even required to be more opinionated and to me more on the right end of that scale. So I'm going to show you a video now about wealth inequality that has a point of view, but that I think carries off the message with that point of view very effectively.
There's a chart I saw recently that I can't get out of my head. A Harvard business professor and economist asked more than 5,000 Americans how they thought wealth was distributed in the United States. This is what they said they thought it was. Dividing the country into 5 rough groups of the top, bottom, and middle 3 20% groups, they asked people how they thought the wealth in this country was divided. Then he asked them what they thought was the ideal distribution. And 92%, that's at least 9 out of 10 of them, said it should be more like this. In other words, more equitable than they think it is. Now that fact is telling, admittedly, the notion that most Americans know that the system is already skewed unfairly. But what's most interesting to me is the reality compared to our perception. The ideal is as far removed from our perception of reality as the actual distribution is from what we think exists in this country. So ignore the ideal for a moment. Here's what we think it is again. And here is the actual distribution. Shockingly skewed. Not only do the bottom 20% and the next 20%, the bottom 40% of Americans barely have any of the wealth. I mean, it's hard to even see them on the chart. But the top 1% has more of the country's wealth than 9 out of 10 Americans believe the entire top 20% should have. Mind-blowing. But let's look at it another way, because I find this chart kind of difficult to wrap my head around. Instead, let's reduce the 311 million Americans to just a representative 100 people. Make it simple. Here they are. Teachers, coaches, firefighters, construction workers, engineers, doctors, lawyers, some investment bankers, a CEO, maybe a celebrity or two. Now let's line them up according to their wealth. Poorest people on the left, wealthiest on the right, just a steady row of folks based on their net worth. We'll color code them like we did before based on which 20% quintile they fall into. Now let's reduce the total wealth of the United States, which was roughly $54 trillion in 2009, to this symbolic pile of cash. And let's distribute it among our 100 Americans. Well, here's socialism, all the wealth of the country distributed equally. We all know that won't work. We need to encourage people to work and work hard to achieve that good old American dream and keep our country moving forward. So, here's that ideal we asked everyone about. Something like this curve. This isn't too bad. We've got some incentive, as the wealthiest folks are now about 10 to 20 times better off than the poorest Americans. But hey, even the poor folks aren't actually poor, since the poverty line has stayed almost entirely off the chart. We have a super healthy middle class with a smooth transition into wealth. And yes, Republicans and Democrats alike chose this curve. 9 out of 10 people, 92%, said this was a nice, ideal distribution of America's wealth. But let's move on. This is what people think America's wealth distribution actually looks like. Not as equitable, clearly, but for me, even this still looks pretty great. Yes, the poorest 20 to 30% are starting to suffer quite a lot compared to the ideal, and the middle class is certainly struggling more than they were, while the rich and wealthy are making roughly 100 times that of the poorest Americans, and about 10 times that of the still healthy middle class. Sadly, this isn't even close to the reality. Here is the actual distribution of wealth in America. The poorest Americans don't even register. They're down to pocket change. And the middle class is barely distinguishable from the poor. In fact, even the rich between the top 10 and 20 percentile are worse off. Only the top 10% are better off.
All right,
how much better off? So much better off. They're down to pocket change. The wealthy are making roughly 100 times that of the poorest Americans, and about 10 times that of the still healthy middle class. Sadly, this isn't even close to the reality. Here is the actual distribution of wealth in America. The poorest Americans don't even register. They're down to pocket change. And the middle class is barely distinguishable from the poor. In fact, even the rich between the top 10 and 20 percentile are worse off. Only the top 10% are better off. And how much better off? So much better off that the top 2 to 5% are actually off the chart at this scale. And the top 1%, this guy, well, his stack of money stretches 10 times higher than we can show. Here's his stack of cash, restacked, all by itself. This is the top 1% we've been hearing so much about. So much green in his pockets that I have to give him a whole new column of his own, because he won't fit on my chart. 1% of America has 40% of all the nation's wealth. The bottom 80%, 8 out of every 10 people, or 80 out of these 100, only has 7% between them. And this has only gotten worse in the last 20 to 30 years. While the richest 1% take home almost a quarter of the national income today, in 1976, they took home only 9%, meaning their share of income has nearly tripled in the last 30 years. The top 1% own half the country's stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. The bottom 50% of Americans own only 0.5% of these investments, which means they aren't investing. They're just scraping by. I'm sure many of these wealthy people have worked very hard for their money, but do you really believe that the CEO is working 380 times harder than his average employee? Not his lowest paid employee, not the janitor, but the average earner in his company. The average worker needs to work more than a month to earn what the CEO makes in 1 hour. We certainly don't have to go all the way to socialism to find something that is fair for hardworking Americans. We don't even have to achieve what most of us consider might be ideal. All we need to do is wake up and realize that the reality in this country is not at all what we think it is.
Every time I see this, I get depressed. So clearly opinionated, clearly with a point of view, but also emotionally very engaging, right? You have to admit, if you agree with his point of view or not, doesn't matter, but it is emotionally engaging, and it tells the story very well, and I do believe that the facts seem to support the story. Now, of course, he framed the story in a particular way. And that's what I mean by framing, right? So that's what I mean by having a clear message and maybe being opinionated. Can this backfire? Of course it can, right? You have to know your audience. In this case, the audience is the internet, and clearly he wanted to spread his point of view, and that's perfectly legitimate. You wouldn't show this in the boardroom of one of the top 500 corporations. So you have to keep that in mind, but also keep in mind that messaging and emotional storytelling is very, very powerful. And I bet you're going to remember this video probably most of all the videos that you've seen today, just because of that emotional impact. And sorry about breaking the emotional impact by screwing up the video. Let me just talk in the last couple of minutes a little bit about visual story design, because there's particular things you can do when you have visualizations and graphical elements, either in your notebooks or, maybe more importantly, in your 2-minute videos or in your presentations. So this is the graph I showed you before on the left, and somebody, Andy Cotgrave, took that graph, and all he did is he flipped it into the traditional bar chart, and he changed the color. Right? If you actually look closely, he didn't even bother changing anything else. He just literally flipped it. Now, the point here is, the only difference is the orientation and the color, yet you have to agree the one on the right is not nearly as emotionally as impactful as the one on the left. So the choice of color and the orientation and the title made all the difference. Right? So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. Sometimes very little things can have a very big difference. Choosing the color red to highlight things might actually have an emotional impact, and you have to consider this. The New York Times, again, is a master in storytelling with visuals, and if you look at even the static paper that they put out, they always have fantastic visualizations. And without getting into the detail of this one here, I just want to point out the features that they use to tell the story with these kind of graphics. The first is, every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And the beginning is always on the upper left, at least in Western culture. Right? So whenever you start your story, you start with the title, and you start on the upper left. That's where people first focus, and that's been shown in many eye tracking studies where you measure where people actually look on websites and on paper. Secondly, there is a middle, so you can have some more information that's typically more towards the right. And then the details really go at the end. And nowadays it's very fashionable to have these infinitely scrolling websites, right? So, if even your IPython notebooks are infinitely scrolling, if you will. So the important thing has to go on the top, and then the less important thing has to go on the bottom in your final report. So it's obvious, but you'd be surprised how many people get this very basic thing wrong. Then there's many important features within it. You have to have a headline, and we talked about make your headline basically the answer to the most important question that you found. It's very important to bring your message across as quickly as possible, and don't make the audience think, hit them over the head with, this is my major finding, XYZ correlates with blah. If that's your message, make that the headline. Add captions, because captions tell the story in more detail. A graph is very impactful, but people usually crave for more insight. What does the graph actually show? Put a lot of captions around your graphs. You can have call-out features or annotations where you call out very particular points in a graph that you have. Here is where my classifier all of a sudden started to work, and my ROC curve all of a sudden started to look better. And point that out with an arrow and put a little annotation there so that the reader and the TFs and everybody who looks at it can easily identify it. Maybe you want to add more detail that is a little bit, a side point as a side story within the graph. You can have a call-out box. You just put additional information within the graph that is kind of separated. So here are a couple examples of visuals that do this well. Here is where the power is out and returning across the northeast. This is when Hurricane Sandy fell, and the question was, where is the power out and where is it coming back on? And you see the map there. It's a little bit washed out, but you can see the map of the east coast of the United States with the bubbles that show you customers without power. And clearly the New Jersey, New York area was mostly affected. We kind of got spared in Massachusetts, or maybe they didn't have the data in this particular case. And then you see within the tri-state area where the power is out and how long it takes to restore power. And you kind of see the numbers of customers affected, that curve going down. So it's a simple story, but it's told well with visuals. And again, it has a beginning and a middle. And then if you scroll down, you can get more and more detail. Here is another one. Where there's smoke, there's cancer. Cancer rates are up, but mortality is down. New diagnostic treatments are responsible for part of this trend, but the greatest single contributing factor is the decline in smoking. Rates are at their lowest level in 50 years. So then the story is told in stages, very explicitly. You know, you take the reader by the hand. Don't have them think too much. Make it easy for them. Number one, increased incidence of cancer based on women and women and men. Fewer deaths. Number two, decline of lung cancer. 4, decline in smoking. And then 5, impact of smoking on cancer deaths. And this is all supporting the message that was already in the headline. So to wrap up, when you're telling a story about your data, you have to know the audience and you should target them, right? If it's, you know, just your TFs, your IPython notebooks are a perfect vehicle. You don't need to tell a fancy story with emotional impact. You know, your TF might weep anyway. So you just tell the facts, right? But if you put something in a 2-minute video that is targeted at the internet, you have to know that audience and it's telling a different story. Your 2-minute video becomes an ad for your report. So you kind of have to make it engaging and exciting for people. So make it engaging, make it memorable. Answer concise questions. Don't ramble. You know, answer the questions and make it obvious which questions you answered. And carefully design your story. So in particular for your final website and for the video, make sure that things look nice. Design does matter. Beautiful things are perceived as more valuable. So, you know, that's just human nature. So make your design nice. And, of course, follow the visualization principles we talked about before. Most importantly, have integrity. And then finally, if you really want people to take action, you do have to have a point of view. So you have to be a little bit more towards the opinionated side and get them emotionally engaged. Don't hit them over the head and keep in mind the audience. But, you know, it's okay to have some emotional impact if you want to change the world with whatever you did. Just further reading. The Functional Art is a great book by Alberto Cairo. He's a journalist that is really interested in visual storytelling, and he actually takes you through many of his designs and explains them and his process. Presentation Zen is a great book about presentations. It tells you basically use fewer words, use more pictures, and he has, again, a lot of nice examples. Made to Stick is about telling stories that have an impact, and it gives you a bunch of things to consider if you really want to have a story that sticks in people's minds. And finally, Nancy Duarte, she designed the presentation in, what was Al Gore's talk called again? I'm drawing a blank. Inconvenient Truth, thank you. In the Inconvenient Truth movie. So all of the visuals were designed by her design studio. And so in her book, she talks a lot about emotional impact of visuals and how you can tell an emotional story. All right, so that's all we have. And please keep those things in mind in your homework and more importantly for your final project. Thank you.